Taste the food, Eleanor, my daughter-in-law whispered with a smile, while warm mashed potatoes slid down the sleeve of my champagne-colored dress, and every guest at my son's wedding suddenly became very interested in their wine glasses instead of looking at me. The ballroom at the Grand Bellamy Hotel had looked beautiful just minutes earlier. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across the marble floors, and the string quartet near the dance floor was playing the same Frank Sinatra song my late husband Thomas used to hum while washing dishes on Sunday mornings. I had spent 8 months helping plan this wedding. 8 months smiling through cake tastings, floral consultations, seating chart arguments, and endless late-night phone calls from Vanessa about napkin shades and centerpiece heights. At 68 years old, I thought I had earned the right to quietly enjoy my only son's wedding day. Instead, I found myself standing beside the buffet table with mashed potatoes clinging to my pearl earrings while 200 guests pretended not to notice the humiliation unfolding 3 feet away from them. "Mom, maybe just go clean up," Daniel said softly, not even stepping toward me. That hurt more than Vanessa's cold little smile ever could. My son looked uncomfortable, embarrassed even, but not shocked. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not broke. Shifted. Because shocked people react. Shocked people defend their mothers. Daniel only adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo and glanced nervously toward his new wife, like a man waiting for permission to breathe. Vanessa laughed lightly and dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "It was an accident," she announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, though her eyes told a completely different story. Eleanor startled me. A few people gave weak smiles. One bridesmaid looked down at the floor. Across the room, I noticed Grace Holloway staring directly at Vanessa with an expression that looked far too knowing for comfort. Grace had been my closest friend for nearly 30 years, and she knew the difference between an accident and cruelty dressed in silk. I reached for a cocktail napkin and calmly wiped the potatoes from my cheek. My hands did not shake. That surprised even me. Vanessa had spent years testing how much disrespect I would tolerate. Small things at first. Excluding me from family photos during holidays. Correcting my grammar in front of guests. Laughing whenever I talked about traditions she called outdated. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she wanted an audience. Tonight, she wanted to prove something. The photographer awkwardly lowered his camera while waiters stood frozen beside silver trays of champagne glasses. Somewhere near the dance floor, someone forced out an uncomfortable laugh that quickly disappeared into silence. Vanessa stepped closer to Daniel and slipped her arm through his as though she had just won something valuable. Maybe she thought she had. Maybe they both did. I looked around the ballroom one last time, at the expensive flower arrangements I had partially paid for, at the 5-tier wedding cake Vanessa insisted needed imported sugar flowers from New York, at the gold monogram menus I spent 3 weeks helping address by hand, because Vanessa claimed calligraphy aggravated her wrist. Then I looked at my son. Really looked at him. And for the first time in 38 years, I realized my son was not standing beside me anymore. He had chosen his side long before tonight. I picked up my purse from the empty chair beside the table and smiled gently at the guests staring in silence. "Please enjoy the evening," I said quietly. "It's a beautiful wedding." Then I walked out of the ballroom alone, while Vanessa's laughter followed softly behind me, and neither of them had the slightest idea that by the end of their honeymoon, everything they thought belonged to them would already be slipping away. The drive home took 43 minutes, but it felt much longer with dried gravy stiffening against the collar of my dress and silence filling every corner of the car. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel as downtown Chicago lights blurred through the windshield like distant stars reflected on dark water. My phone rested untouched in the cup holder beside me. No calls. No messages. Not even from Daniel. That hurt in ways I could not fully explain yet. For 38 years, I had been the first person he called whenever life frightened him. When he was 7 and broke his arm falling off his bicycle, he cried for me in the emergency room before the nurses even finished cutting away his little baseball shirt. When he failed his first law school exam at 23, he sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning eating frozen pie straight from the container while I told him one difficult moment would not define his life. And when Thomas died 3 years ago from the heart attack that stole all the warmth from this house, Daniel stood beside me at the funeral gripping my hand so tightly, I thought he might finally understand what family loyalty meant. Somewhere along the way, that boy disappeared. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the November air had turned sharp and cold. The porch light automatically flicked on as I stepped out of the car, illuminating the front flower beds Thomas once spent entire weekends tending with almost ridiculous dedication. Even now, 3 winters after his death, I still could not bring myself to replace the crooked little stone border he installed himself because he insisted contractors overcharged for work a patient husband could do for free. I unlocked the front door slowly and stepped into the quiet house. No music, no wedding chatter, no polite smiles hiding humiliation beneath expensive makeup and champagne. Just silence, real silence, the kind that settles deep into old homes after midnight. I placed my purse carefully on the entryway table and caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. A streak of dried potatoes still clung near my left shoulder. My pearl earrings looked dull beneath the soft lamplight. For a moment, I simply stood there staring at the reflection of a woman who suddenly looked much older than 68. Not weak, just tired. Tired in the way people become after spending years pretending not to notice small cruelties, because acknowledging them would force painful truths into the open. I walked upstairs and changed into one of Thomas's old navy blue sweaters, the oversized one with frayed cuffs, that still faintly smelled like cedar and coffee grounds. Then I carried a cup of chamomile tea into the study where stacks of wedding invoices remained neatly organized across the desk. Vanessa had insisted wedding planning required professional structure, though strangely enough, the professionals never seemed to receive late-night phone calls demanding emergency payments. I sat down slowly and opened the top folder. Floral deposits, venue upgrades, imported linens, designer chair rentals, thousands of dollars layered neatly beneath smiling thank you emails and exclamation points. I turned another page and paused. A charge for $8,400 labeled last-minute hospitality adjustments. I frowned. Vanessa had never mentioned hospitality adjustments. Another invoice appeared underneath for luxury transportation services billed directly to one of my accounts. My stomach tightened slightly. The wedding had cost far more than Daniel originally told me. Much more. Outside, cold wind rattled softly against the study windows while the grandfather clock downstairs marked midnight with heavy measured chimes. I stared at the paperwork spread across Thomas's old mahogany desk and felt something unfamiliar settle quietly into place beneath my sadness. Not anger, clarity. And for the first time since leaving that ballroom, I realized tonight may not have been about humiliation alone. It may have been about removing me from the picture entirely. I slept for less than 2 hours that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel standing beside Vanessa and near the buffet table with that same helpless expression people wear when they know something is wrong, but decide comfort matters more than courage. Around 6 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and walked downstairs to the kitchen while pale winter light slowly crept through the windows overlooking the backyard. The house always felt colder after weddings and holidays, as though celebrations only reminded empty rooms how quiet they had become afterward. I wrapped both hands around a fresh cup of coffee and stared at the stack of unopened mail beside the fruit bowl until the doorbell rang. Unexpectedly, at first I assumed it might be Daniel arriving with guilt heavy enough to finally push him toward an apology. But when I opened the front door, Grace Holloway stood on the porch wearing a camel-colored wool coat and an expression that immediately told me she had not come for casual conversation. "I brought cinnamon rolls," she said softly, lifting a white bakery box with forced brightness. Grace always brought food when difficult truths followed behind her. I stepped aside without speaking, and she entered slowly, glancing around the house like someone preparing to deliver bad news in a hospital room. We sat at the kitchen table Thomas bought during our second year of marriage, the oak surface still marked with tiny scratches from decades of family dinners and school projects. Grace removed her gloves carefully and folded them beside her purse before finally looking at me directly. "Eleanor," she began quietly, "what happened last night was not an accident." I did not answer immediately. Instead, I stirred cream into my coffee, even though I had already done it twice. "I know," I said at last. Grace exhaled slowly, almost with relief. "I was in the bridal suite before the ceremony," she admitted. "Vanessa was drinking champagne with the bridesmaids. One of the girls mentioned how generous you had been paying for so much of the wedding." Grace hesitated briefly before continuing. Vanessa laughed and said, Please. Eleanor likes acting important. After tonight, she is out of our lives for good anyway. The kitchen suddenly felt very still. Outside, bare tree branches swayed softly against gray morning skies, while the furnace hummed somewhere deep inside the walls. Did Daniel hear her say that? I asked quietly. Grace looked down at her untouched coffee. Not those exact words. But he heard enough. Something cold settled deeper in my chest then. Not heartbreak anymore. Recognition. Grace reached into her purse and removed her reading glasses before speaking again. There is more, she said gently. Last month at the bridal shower, Vanessa joked that you were basically a walking retirement account with pearls. I gave a faint smile that did not feel like smiling at all. That sounds like Vanessa. Grace leaned forward slightly. No, Eleanor. You are still minimizing this. Her voice softened. She humiliated you on purpose because she thought you would quietly absorb it the same way you always absorb everything else. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The coffee had already gone lukewarm in my hands. I looked past Grace toward the refrigerator where an old photograph remained held beneath a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. Daniel was 12 in the picture, standing beside Thomas at Lake Geneva, holding a fishing pole almost taller than he was. They were both smiling so hard their eyes nearly disappeared. Back then, Daniel used to become furious whenever classmates teased weaker children at school. He once punched a locker hard enough to bruise his hand because another boy mocked a janitor with a stutter. Thomas had been secretly proud of that story for years. I do not understand when my son became a man who watches cruelty in silence, I whispered. Grace's expression turned sad in a way that made her suddenly look much older than 62. Usually, she said carefully, people do not become someone else overnight. Usually they just reveal who they already were once they stop needing your approval. Her words stayed with me long after she left that morning, echoing quietly through the empty house, while upstairs on Thomas's old desk, a folder full of wedding invoices waited for me to finally read every line carefully. After Grace left, I carried the wedding invoices upstairs to Thomas's study and closed the door behind me, as though I were sealing myself inside a room full of ghosts. The late morning sun stretched pale stripes across the hardwood floor, catching tiny dust particles drifting lazily through the quiet air. Thomas always hated dusty rooms. Every Saturday morning for nearly 40 years, he walked through this house with an old yellow cloth tucked into his back pocket, wiping bookshelves and picture frames while humming old jazz songs terribly off-key. I could almost hear him now as I sat down behind the mahogany desk and opened the second folder of financial documents. The numbers blurred together at first. Floral upgrades, catering revisions, transportation fees, additional accommodations for special guests. Vanessa had a talent for making luxury sound necessary. I slowly removed my reading glasses and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose as exhaustion settled heavily behind my eyes. Then something unusual caught my attention. A payment authorization form with my electronic signature attached to a $12,000 transfer for honeymoon hospitality enhancements. My stomach tightened immediately. I never approved $12,000 for hospitality enhancements. I leaned closer to the page. The signature looked almost correct, but not entirely. The curve on the E in Eleanor slanted too sharply upward. Tiny details most people would never notice. But Thomas used to joke that after 30 years working as a school librarian, I could identify forged handwriting from across a parking lot. I reached for another folder and found more charges. Designer furniture rentals for the reception lounge. Imported champagne upgrades. Luxury spa reservations attached to the honeymoon suite in Napa Valley. Piece by piece, the truth began assembling itself quietly in front of me like a puzzle finally revealing its image. Vanessa had not simply embarrassed me at the wedding. She had been using me for months with the confidence of someone already certain there would never be consequences. I sat back slowly in Thomas's leather chair and stared toward the bookshelf lining the far wall. Framed family photographs stood between rows of old biographies and hardcover novels. Daniel at age 5 wearing a firefighter costume 3 sizes too large. Daniel graduating law school, while Thomas proudly wiped tears behind dark sunglasses because he insisted sunlight irritated his allergies. Daniel standing beside Vanessa during their engagement dinner, smiling with the nervous excitement of a man who still believed love automatically made people kinder. My chest ached unexpectedly at that photograph. There had been warning signs even then. Vanessa corrected the restaurant waiter 3 times over sparkling water brands while Daniel laughed awkwardly beside her. Later that evening, she quietly asked whether Thomas and I planned to help with a future house down payment, since family should invest in family. Thomas noticed my discomfort immediately afterward while we loaded leftovers into the car. She treats generosity like an entitlement, he said quietly that night while loosening his tie in our bedroom mirror. I remember defending her. I told him younger people sometimes spoke carelessly. I told him she probably felt nervous trying to impress us. Thomas only nodded slowly in the patient way husbands sometimes do when they already know their wives will eventually discover painful truths on their own. A sudden vibration pulled me from the memory. My phone lit up against the desk beside the invoices. Daniel's name appeared across the screen for the first time since the wedding. I stared at it ringing in silence while cold November light continued creeping slowly across the floorboards. Part of me still wanted to answer immediately the way mothers do, no matter how deeply wounded they are. But another part of me remembered his face at the reception. Not shocked, not protective, just uncomfortable that public humiliation had interrupted the perfect image of his wedding day. The phone stopped ringing. Seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. I did not play it. Instead, I opened the final folder resting beneath the stack and froze when I saw the title printed neatly across the top page in bold black letters. Whitmore Family Trust Amendments. My hands remained perfectly still as I opened the trust documents, though somewhere deep inside me, old memories were beginning to wake like sleeping animals disturbed by distant thunder. Thomas handled most of our estate planning after his first heart procedure 5 years earlier. At the time, I thought he was simply being practical in the careful, methodical way he approached everything from insurance policies to grocery lists. I remember teasing him one evening because he spent 3 straight hours organizing legal paperwork while snow fell softly outside the kitchen windows. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses and said something that suddenly echoed through my mind now with painful clarity. Families do not fall apart all at once, Eleanor. Usually they unravel quietly while someone keeps pretending everything is fine. Back then, I laughed and told him he had become dramatic in his old age. Now I understood he had been paying attention long before I was willing to see the truth. I carefully turned the pages of the trust amendments while afternoon light faded slowly across the study walls. Most of the language was standard legal wording until one paragraph near the bottom caught my attention hard enough to stop my breathing for a moment. Inheritance distributions to Daniel Whitmore remained conditional upon what the attorney described as continued ethical conduct and respectful familial treatment toward surviving trust beneficiaries. My eyes moved lower. Any documented financial exploitation, coercion, or public humiliation directed toward Eleanor Whitmore would trigger immediate review and possible suspension of asset transfers pending trustee investigation. I read the paragraph 3 times. Then a 4th. Outside, freezing rain began tapping softly against the windows while somewhere downstairs the old refrigerator hummed steadily in the kitchen. Thomas knew. Not everything perhaps, but enough. Enough to quietly prepare protections I never knew existed. A sudden knock startled me before the study door slowly opened. Grace stepped inside holding her umbrella and a small grocery bag. I forgot my gloves earlier, she said gently before noticing the open trust documents spread across the desk. Her expression shifted almost immediately. Oh, she murmured quietly. You found it. I stared at her. You knew about this? Grace hesitated before closing the door behind her. Thomas told me 2 years ago, she admitted softly. Only in case something ever happened to him. My chest tightened painfully. Why would he tell you instead of me? Grace removed her coat carefully and sat across from me in the leather chair Thomas always used while reading Sunday newspapers. Because he knew you would protect Daniel no matter what, she said. Even from himself. The room became very quiet after that. Grace looked older. In the fading afternoon light, her silver hair catching pale shadows near the fireplace while rain streaked softly down the windows behind her. There is something else you need to know, she continued carefully. Last spring, Thomas overheard Vanessa arguing with Daniel after Easter dinner. I frowned slightly. About what? Grace looked uncomfortable. Vanessa wanted Daniel to convince you to sell the house and move into one of those luxury retirement communities near Scottsdale. I stared at her in disbelief. This house was not simply property. Thomas built the backyard deck himself one summer while Daniel handed him nails from a red plastic bucket. Every doorway carried pencil marks measuring Daniel's height year after year, while he grew from a skinny little boy into a tall young man preparing for college. The kitchen still smelled faintly like cinnamon every December because decades of Christmas baking had somehow soaked themselves permanently into the walls. Thomas refused, Grace said quietly. He told Daniel that as long as you lived, this house remained yours completely. I looked down at the trust paperwork again, while something cold and sharp slowly settled into focus inside me. Vanessa had not suddenly turned cruel during the wedding reception. The wedding was simply the first moment she believed the performance was no longer necessary. My phone buzzed again against the desk. This time it was not Daniel. It was a fraud alert from my bank asking me to verify a pending international wire transfer request for $22,000 scheduled to process Monday morning. The fraud alert remained glowing on my phone screen while rain continued falling steadily outside the study windows, turning the backyard into a blur of silver and black shadows beneath the porch lights. $22,000. Scheduled for international transfer Monday morning. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone as I reread the message. I had not authorized any wire transfer. Grace leaned forward immediately after seeing my expression change. What is it? She asked quietly. Instead of answering, I handed her the phone. Her eyes widened as she read the notification. Eleanor, she whispered carefully. You need to call the bank right now. I nodded once and reached for the landline sitting beside the desk. Thomas always preferred landlines for important conversations. Cell phones disappear, he used to say. Paper trails and wired phones do not. The memory almost made me smile as the bank representative answered after 3 rings. I spoke calmly, carefully verifying my identity while Grace sat silently across from me, watching rain streak down the dark windows. The representative explained the transfer request originated from a linked account added less than 2 weeks earlier under temporary authorization permissions connected to wedding expenses. My chest grew colder with every sentence. Vanessa had not only manipulated me emotionally, she had positioned herself financially with astonishing patience. Cancel the transfer immediately, I said quietly, and freeze all temporary authorizations connected to my accounts. The representative hesitated briefly before confirming the freeze would take effect within the hour. Then came the sentence that settled everything permanently in my mind. Mrs. Whitmore, based on the activity history, I strongly recommend reviewing all recent access permissions and beneficiary settings. Beneficiary settings. The call ended several minutes later, leaving the study wrapped once again in silence except for the soft ticking of Thomas's old brass clock on the bookshelf. Grace looked shaken now in a way I had rarely seen during our friendship. She planned this carefully, she murmured. I stared at the rain outside while old moments replayed themselves differently inside my head. Vanessa insisting she help organize online payments to reduce stress. Vanessa volunteering to handle vendor communications after I mentioned difficulty reading small print late at night. Vanessa smiling warmly while guiding me through electronic signatures during rehearsal week, because she claimed modern wedding planning moved too quickly for paper contracts. Every kindness suddenly looked like strategy viewed from the correct angle. I stood slowly and walked toward the bookshelf near the fireplace where Thomas kept several leather-bound journals he wrote in during retirement. Most entries were ordinary things. Garden notes, restaurant recommendations, weather complaints, little observations older men quietly record when life becomes slower and memory starts feeling precious. I pulled down the dark green journal from 2 years ago and opened it carefully. About halfway through, I found a page marked with blue ink. Vanessa asked unusual questions again tonight. Wants details about house ownership and trust access. Daniel looked uncomfortable during dinner. Eleanor still refuses to see what worries me. My throat tightened unexpectedly as I continued reading. If something happens to me before this situation improves, Howard Bennett has full copies of the revised trust protections. Eleanor will resist confrontation because protecting Daniel has become instinctive for her. But someday she may need proof that kindness without boundaries invites predators. I closed the journal slowly while emotion pressed heavily against my chest. Thomas saw everything long before I did. Not because he loved Daniel less, Because he loved me enough to recognize danger even when I kept excusing it away. My phone suddenly buzzed again. This time it was a message from Daniel. Mom, please answer me. Vanessa feels terrible about what happened. It was a misunderstanding and everyone has been overreacting. We are boarding our flight to Napa soon. Can we talk tomorrow? I stared at the words for several seconds before another message appeared beneath it. Also, there seems to be some issue with the honeymoon payment account. The hotel says the authorization was suddenly declined. Do you know anything about that? For the first time since the wedding, I felt something dangerously close to peace settle quietly inside me. Not revenge, not satisfaction, just the calm realization that the balance of power had finally begun to shift. The next morning arrived wrapped in a heavy gray fog that pressed softly against the windows and muted the entire neighborhood into silence. I woke before sunrise and walked downstairs wearing Thomas's old cardigan while the house creaked quietly around me like something alive, remembering its age. For the first time in years, I did not immediately check my phone for messages from Daniel. Instead, I stood in the kitchen slowly grinding coffee beans by hand the way Thomas always preferred on Sunday mornings. The familiar sound felt grounding somehow. Honest. Unlike nearly everything connected to the wedding. By 8 o'clock, my phone finally buzzed again. 3 missed calls from Daniel. 1 voicemail from Vanessa. 2 text messages asking why the honeymoon suite reservation had been canceled overnight. I ignored all of them and carried my coffee into the study where stacks of financial paperwork still covered the desk in careful piles. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street while dead autumn leaves scraped softly across the driveway in the cold wind. The world looked ordinary. That was the strange thing about betrayal. Most mornings after your life changes forever still look exactly the same. Around 9:30, another call came through, this time from Howard Bennett, Thomas's attorney. I had not spoken to Howard since the funeral nearly 3 years earlier, but hearing his calm voice immediately brought back memories of hospital corridors, black umbrellas, and casseroles neighbors left untouched on my kitchen counter because grief made eating feel unnecessary. Mrs. Whitmore, he said gently, I understand there may be concerns regarding the family trust. I glanced toward Thomas's journals stacked beside the fireplace. There are, I replied quietly. Howard did not sound surprised. Thomas prepared for this possibility very carefully, he said. He updated several protections during the last 2 years of his life. My chest tightened again hearing that. Even now, Thomas was somehow still protecting me from storms I refused to believe were coming. Howard continued explaining the trust structure while I took slow, careful notes across a yellow legal pad. Every major family asset remained technically shielded beneath layered ownership provisions controlled through trustee review. The house, investment accounts, property income, even several wedding-related transfers connected to temporary authorizations could now be frozen pending investigation into possible financial misconduct. Mrs. Whitmore, Howard said carefully after a brief pause. There is one more issue you should know about. Yesterday afternoon, someone attempted to request accelerated access to trust distributions on Daniel's behalf. I closed my eyes slowly. Vanessa? The request originated from her email account, he confirmed gently. Fortunately, Thomas specifically prohibited emergency modifications without your direct written approval. For several seconds, I could not speak. Rainwater still clung to the backyard windows, while the grandfather clock downstairs marked each passing minute with slow, deliberate certainty. Everything Vanessa touched seemed connected to money now. Access, ownership, control. Even humiliation at the wedding suddenly looked less emotional and more strategic, as though public disrespect had simply been another method of testing how far she could push me before resistance appeared. Howard's voice softened slightly. Thomas worried that Daniel confused love with obligation, he admitted quietly. He feared your son might eventually allow someone else to weaponize your kindness against you. After the call ended, I remained seated motionless behind the desk for a very long time. Then my phone vibrated once more. This time, however, it was not Daniel or Vanessa. It was Grace. Check social media before Vanessa deletes anything. I frowned and opened the message attachment she sent seconds later. A video clip began playing silently across my screen. The wedding reception. Bright ballroom lights. Laughter. Champagne glasses. Then Vanessa's voice clearly captured near the buffet table while speaking to 2 bridesmaids before the incident happened. By next month, Daniel's mother will finally be out of our lives and out of that house. One bridesmaid laughed nervously while Vanessa smiled directly into her champagne glass. Trust me, she continued lightly. Old women always mistake politeness for loyalty. The video ended there. My reflection stared back faintly from the darkened phone screen. For the first time since the wedding, I no longer felt confused about what was happening. Vanessa had declared war long before mashed potatoes touched my dress. I had simply been the last person to realize it. By late afternoon, the fog had finally lifted from the neighborhood, leaving behind a pale cold sunlight that made every bare tree branch outside look sharp enough to cut glass. I spent most of the day inside Thomas's study reviewing financial statements while a quiet kind of clarity settled deeper into me with every passing hour. There were more unauthorized charges than I originally realized. Luxury hotel upgrades. Designer purchases hidden beneath vague vendor descriptions. Multiple account access requests tied directly to devices registered under Vanessa's name. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. She had not impulsively crossed boundaries. She had slowly erased them one careful step at a time while smiling across holiday dinner tables and thanking me for homemade pies. Around 4 o'clock, my phone finally rang again. Daniel. This time, I answered. Silence greeted me first. Then the strained sound of my son exhaling heavily somewhere far away. Mom, he said quietly, what is happening? I looked out the study window toward the backyard deck Thomas built 20 years earlier during one impossibly hot July. He spent 3 weekends measuring every board twice because he claimed shortcuts always become expensive eventually. That depends, I replied calmly. What have you been told? Another pause. I could hear muffled voices in the background. Hotel lobby noise. Rolling luggage wheels. Vanessa speaking sharply to someone nearby before lowering her voice again. The hotel froze our reservation this morning, Daniel admitted. Then our bank flagged several transactions. Vanessa says there must be some misunderstanding with the wedding accounts. I closed my eyes briefly at the word misunderstanding. Such a gentle word for betrayal. Daniel, I said softly, did you know Vanessa added herself to my financial authorizations? The silence on the other end lasted too long. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller somehow. She said you approved it because wedding planning was stressful. I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me. Of course she did. And did you know she attempted to access the family trust yesterday? This time I heard him inhale sharply. What? He whispered. That is impossible. No, I replied quietly. Unfortunately, it is very possible. Another long silence followed. I imagined Daniel standing somewhere inside an expensive Napa Valley hotel lobby, wearing the same confused expression he carried at the wedding reception while his new wife carefully rearranged reality around him sentence by sentence. Mom, he finally said, Vanessa would never steal from you. I almost smiled then. Not because the situation felt amusing, but because even now my son still framed the issue around intention instead of behavior. Daniel, I said gently. People rarely call themselves thieves while taking from you. He did not answer. Somewhere behind him, Vanessa's voice rose louder now, irritated and impatient. I could not make out the words clearly, only the tone. Sharp, controlled, angry at losing control of something. Then suddenly Daniel spoke again, lower this time. The hotel manager just came back, he said carefully. Apparently our suite was reserved using an account connected to your trust distributions. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. That should not have happened, I replied. Those accounts were never intended for personal luxury expenses. More silence. Then quietly, almost like a frightened child again, Daniel asked the question I think he had been avoiding for years. Mom, what exactly did Dad put in that trust? I looked toward Thomas's photograph resting beside the bookshelf. He wore his favorite navy sweater in the picture, smiling gently while autumn leaves blurred behind him at Lake Geneva. Some people leave money behind when they die. Thomas left warnings. Your father protected me, I answered softly, from anyone who might mistake my kindness for weakness. Daniel did not speak again for several seconds. Then, very faintly in the background, I heard Vanessa snap at him. Stop standing there and fix this. Not please. Not can we solve this together. Fix this. Like my son had become an employee assigned to repair an inconvenience. And, for the first time since the wedding, I think Daniel finally heard it too. 3 months later, The first snow of December drifted softly across the backyard, while warm cinnamon and roasted turkey filled the house with the kind of comfort I thought had disappeared from my life forever. The dining room glowed beneath candlelight reflected gently against the old crystal chandelier. Thomas insisted on repairing himself every Christmas season because he claimed professional electricians lacked patience and charged too much. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt heavy with tension disguised as politeness. It felt peaceful, real peace, the kind built quietly after painful truths finally stop hiding in the corners of every conversation. Grace sat at the dining table arranging silverware, while soft jazz music played low from the kitchen radio. Across from her, our neighbors Arthur and Denise laughed over a pie recipe disagreement that had somehow lasted nearly 20 minutes. Simple voices, simple warmth, no performances, no careful manipulation hidden beneath perfect smiles. I carried the turkey from the kitchen slowly, smiling faintly when Grace immediately stood to help me despite my protests. Thomas would yell at both of us for lifting this alone, she said lightly. I looked toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, where Thomas always sat carving Thanksgiving turkey with theatrical seriousness, while Daniel rolled his eyes every single year. The chair remained empty tonight, but somehow it no longer felt lonely. It felt respectful, like leaving space for someone still deeply loved. My phone rested untouched on the hallway table nearby. Earlier that afternoon, Daniel left another voicemail. Softer this time, quieter. Gone was the defensiveness that once wrapped around every conversation involving Vanessa. The divorce proceedings had started 6 weeks ago after investigators confirmed extensive unauthorized financial activity linked to multiple accounts and trust access attempts. Vanessa left Napa alone after their honeymoon collapsed under frozen transactions and legal reviews. Daniel eventually returned home to Chicago looking thinner, older, and somehow strangely uncertain of who he had become inside that marriage. We spoke twice since then. Brief conversations. Careful conversations. The kind people have when trust has been cracked but not entirely destroyed. Healing, I realized, moves much slower than betrayal. Eleanor, Grace called gently from the dining room, pulling me back into the present. You are smiling again. I blinked softly, surprised to realize she was right. Somewhere between the investigation, the quiet legal meetings with Howard Bennett, and the long evenings spent rereading Thomas's journals beside the fireplace, something inside me had changed permanently. Not hardened, clarified. I finally understood that love without boundaries eventually teaches people to mistake sacrifice for obligation. For years, I believed enduring disrespect peacefully made me strong. Thomas knew better. Real strength was recognizing when silence stopped being kindness and started becoming permission. Dinner passed slowly beneath candlelight and laughter while snow continued falling steadily outside the windows. At one point, Denise complimented the old family photographs lining the hallway, and I found myself telling stories again. Not painful stories. Warm ones. Daniel catching his first fish at Lake Geneva. Thomas burning an entire tray of pancakes one Father's Day because he insisted fathers deserved breakfast in bed too. Grace laughed so hard at that story, she nearly spilled cranberry sauce across the tablecloth. The sound filled the room beautifully. Later that evening, after everyone left with leftovers wrapped carefully in foil, I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes beneath warm water while soft snow covered the backyard deck outside. The house creaked gently around me, old and familiar and still completely mine. My eyes drifted toward the hallway mirror where 3 months earlier I once stood covered in humiliation and heartbreak after leaving the wedding reception alone. I barely recognized that woman now. Not because revenge transformed me, because truth did. My phone buzzed once more on the counter beside me. Another message from Daniel. Mom, I know I cannot undo what happened, but someday I hope I can become someone Dad would respect again. I stared at the words quietly before setting the phone back down untouched. Then I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly through the peaceful house, while snow continued falling softly outside. And for the first time in a very long while, I no longer felt afraid of being alone.